Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to our special event. So this is Affordable Housing Now and Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. We're the sponsors of this event, and this is one of a whole series of events during Affordable Housing Month. And later on toward the end, we will put in the chat a link to other Affordable Housing Month events. There are many of them. They're all fascinating, but ours is really important because it's going to focus on the housing element. So our goal today is to help you understand what a housing element is, why they matter, and to inform you about what is and may be happening for affordable housing in North County. And there will be another event that is just about housing elements, but ours is just featuring North County. So I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers that we have today. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker will be Alyssa Kroger. Wave, Alyssa, thank you.
Hi, everybody.
She is the housing manager of the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. And following her will be Suzanne Issei. Suzanne is the principal planner for the Santa Cruz County Planning Department. Following Suzanne will be Jack Dellis, Scotts Valley City Council member, and also a member of its housing subcommittee. Followed by Jim Reed, the vice mayor of Scotts Valley City Council. And then at the end will be Linda Kerner, who is a founding member of Affordable Housing Now, and she will sort of close things out. And after that, we'll have you ask questions. So we're asking you to please hold your questions until after all of the speakers. That makes things flow more freely, and it allows our speakers to kind of focus in on what they had planned to say. But if a question occurs to you as it goes along, put it in the chat right away. The speakers will be glancing at that every once in a while, and they may be able to incorporate your question into their presentation. So let's jump right into it. So Alyssa Kroger is going to explain the housing element and about the new cycle that's coming up that begins in 2023. Alyssa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Alyssa Kroger, and I'm the Housing Program Manager for Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. MBEP is a regional member-supported nonprofit organization consisting of public, private, and civic entities located throughout the counties of Monterey, San Benito, and Santa Cruz. Founded in 2015, our mission is to improve the economic health and quality of life in the region. So it's only fitting that one of our more robust initiatives is focused on addressing this multifaceted housing crisis through a three-pronged approach, advocating for an increase in housing supply across all income levels. That said, I'm going to go over a higher level overview of what the housing element is in general, and Suzanne Issei from the county, as well as Vice Mayor Jim Reed and Councilmember Jack Dillis from Scott Valley will dive a little deeper into local specifics. I'll also add some additional info and resources into the chat after my presentation. So, what is a housing element? Simply put, it's a blueprint for how a city will meet its housing needs over the next 8 years. Since 1969, California has required that all local government, cities, and counties adequately plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in the community. This involves analyzing current and future housing needs and requires local government to develop an actionable plan to zone and build for that need, which takes into consideration things like income levels, unit types, and other community barriers to access. This plan must include metrics to measure against progress made toward achieving this goal in the 8-year cycle. So the housing element utilizes a regional housing needs allocation, which housers often refer to as RHNA. A different number of units is assigned to each city by each region's council of governments. For the Monterey Bay area, this is the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, or AMBAG. The RHNA plan establishes the total number of housing units that each city and county must plan for within an 8-year planning period. The amount of housing a region must plan for is mainly determined by the California Housing and Community Development Department's, or HCD's, housing need assessment. The regional determination includes an overall housing need number, as well as the percentage of units required in different income categories and across geographic areas of opportunity. Per HCD, the statutory objectives of the RHNA process are to ensure jurisdictions have the capacity to do 5 things. 1, increase the housing supply and mix of housing types, so affordability in an equitable manner. Promote infill development and socioeconomic equity. Protect environmental and agricultural resources and encourage efficient development patterns. 3, promote improved intra-regional jobs to housing relationship, including jobs to housing fit. 4, balance disproportionate household income distributions. And 5, affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is something we'll dive a little deeper into in a moment. Moving on to the next slide. All right, so why does the housing element matter? Residents are directly affected by local government's ability to plan for housing needs of people who live, work, study, and even play in their community. RHNA is an opportunity to do something more about our housing challenges by collectively rolling up our sleeves and getting creative, doing things like increasing zoning capacity, increasing access to housing, increasing affordability, and codifying anti-racist policies and methodology. Plainly put, this is a once-in-a-decade opportunity for all of us to get involved in solving this problem. All right, so what's this affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH, piece we keep hearing so much about? It's a piece of state legislation from 2018 that stems from the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act, which is a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's intended to combat housing discrimination, eliminate racial bias, undo historic patterns of segregation, and lift barriers that restrict access in order to foster inclusive communities and achieve racial equity, fair housing choice, and opportunity for Californians. Effective January 1st, 2021, all Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, or AMBAG, jurisdictions must submit elements that seek to affirmatively further fair housing by December 2023. This involves looking at your community demographics, opportunity areas, and various barriers to access services in your community, and creating a plan and outreach strategy that effectively addresses those things. So I just want to briefly show the current RHNA numbers for the AMBAG jurisdictions, but I won't go into too much detail as other panelists will be diving in on a more local angle soon. The main takeaway I want to share here is that the 6 cycle numbers are about 3-fold higher than previous cycles, which I think is exciting. This might just be the push that we all need to really start leveling out the supply and demand for housing in our communities. So this slide is just to highlight the overall timeline process for the 6 cycle housing element. AMBAG received its 6 cycle regional housing needs determination from HCD in August of 2021. AMBAG released the draft 6 cycle RHNA plan on April 22nd of 2022 for a 45-day public review period. The public review period closes on June 6th, 2022, and the final 6 cycle RHNA plan is scheduled for adoption in fall of 2022. So the Monterey Bay region is required to submit a final plan by December of 2023, and the cycle will end in December 2030. All of this is to say that this process has been ongoing since summer 2021, and local governments will be engaging with the community from now through December 2023. So keep an eye out for future communication and meetings to stay involved on your local housing element process. Finally, given that this will be an ongoing process with opportunities to engage, MBEP will be continuing to track local progress across the region and will stay engaged with local government and communities as advocacy opportunities arise. So some of this engagement looks like helping to identify and support engagement opportunities as local jurisdictions prepare to update their respective housing elements. Some of this includes participation in AMBAG board and city council meetings, It looks like continuing to organize regional workshops with local advocates in the Tri-County region. It looks like developing a housing elements best practices white paper to provide technical assistance to Monterey Bay jurisdictions, which we're hoping to put out in the fall of 2022. So stay tuned for that. And on a similar note, and just a couple months from now, summer 2022, we'll be updating our 2018 white paper on realistic short-term policy changes that local governments can implement to help achieve their RHNA. And finally, we track and support state legislation that will help achieve RHNA goals like Friedman's Bill AB 2097, which aims to increase housing feasibility by eliminating parking mandates on new homes built near high quality transit. So that concludes my portion of this presentation. We'll hold time for Q&A, as Tim mentioned, at the end of the presentation, but I'll add my email and a few resources and links in the chat now. And you're all more than welcome to reach out to me or the rest of my team at MBEP and the folks here on this webinar today if you'd like to learn more and stay engaged with our work in the future. And with that, I'll now pass the stage over to Suzanne Issei, Principal Planner of the Santa Cruz County Planning Department, and stop sharing my screen while I add those resources I talked about in the chat for you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alyssa. So welcome again, everybody. We appreciate you taking time out of your Saturday on a beautiful day like this to geek out with us on housing topics in Affordable Housing Month. So I'm going to talk a little bit about housing elements, focusing on specifically the County of Santa Cruz and the work we do that affects the unincorporated area. I want to give you a little bit of a slightly deeper dive into the policy background of housing elements and then some of the other documents and regulations that affect housing development generally. And I will touch on a little bit of detail on the San Lorenzo Valley and issues affecting that area of the county, and then talk a little bit about current county efforts to help make housing development more feasible for folks, and also some future opportunities both for the county as well as for members of the public who want to get involved. So let's talk a little bit about where the housing element fits in this framework of state and local policies, laws, regulations. I won't mention federal, but obviously federal law does apply to some extent, although it's not the key level of government in the case of housing elements, because housing elements is specifically a California concept and a California requirement. So there's a number of state laws that affect the work we do in planning and that relate to housing elements, but two of the specific ones that are really key here is particularly one called the Planning and Zoning Law. And this law requires that all cities and counties throughout the state have what we call a general plan, and also some sort of zoning codes. Sometimes it's referred to as the zoning ordinance. Now, both the general plan and the zoning codes have maps that go along with them, because these are specifically documents that regulate what people can do with land, primarily the land that they own. And so mapping is a key part of that. The other components that go along with the general plan and zoning are health and safety codes, both at the state level and the local level. And then, you know, in order to actually build something based on all of these codes and regulations, you need, in most cases, you need a permit from your local government. In some cases, you might need a permit of some special nature from a state agency as well. So let's go back to the housing element. So the reason it's called an element is that it is one element of the local government's general plan. Now, that planning and zoning law that I mentioned, which was written quite a few decades ago, I believe it was in the 50s, required that at a minimum, everyone's general plan has to include at least these 7 elements, or essentially you could think of it as like a chapter in a book. So the general plan is this big fat book, and these are the different chapters of the book. In the case of the land use element and some of the others, there's also maps that are very key that go along with some of the narrative text that is included in these different chapters. So here on the screen, I've highlighted for you two that are really the most relevant when we're talking about where and how housing can be developed. So it's the land use element, which you don't hear nearly as much about, and the housing element. So I like to tell folks, the housing element is nice, but what really governs what you can do with a piece of property is the land use element and the land use maps and the zoning ordinance and the zoning maps. The housing element is kind of the icing on the cake, but the actual cake is in the land use element. So I like to tell all my advocate friends and anyone else who is interested, don't just read the housing element, read the land use element, look at the maps. When things are being updated in your local area, participate in the update of the land use element or the zoning code. It just so happens that in the county, we have been working on updating our general plan land use element and several of these other elements, including circulation, open space, conservation, and safety. We have a policy project that we're working on right now that has been in the works for I think 6 or 7 years at this point. But we finally have gotten to the point of community participation and releasing draft documents for the community to review, including draft maps. And that is going on right now. And I'll get into that in a little more detail in just a moment. So, for example, this is a map of the county's current general plan land use map. And I've highlighted roughly the area that we think of as the San Lorenzo Valley on the map here. And what you can see is these areas that are in sort of the bright green, this sort of lime green color, that indicates land that is available for farming, what we call ag lands. This sort of minty darker green color is generally open space conservation. So these generally correspond to the state parks. Like this is Nisene Mark State Park. This is Big Basin up here. There's some other parks in the area. So you can see right off the bat, a lot of the area in the county is taken up for these conservation and resource, natural resource purposes. The parts of the map that are available for housing, it's a little hard to see at this scale because obviously, you can't drill down into the details that well at this scale. But if you see along the coast here in the area that's generally like Live Oak between Capitola and Santa Cruz, Soquel, Aptos, you can see some orange on the map here and some darker orange and some sort of yellowish color. Those colors generally are what's available for housing development. So the orange is like a medium density housing, the darker orange is a higher density housing development, and then the yellow is mostly typically a single family housing or maybe like duets, duplexes, that kind of thing. And then you'll also see some pink. That's for things like commercial development and other types of special, more urban uses. Now, the county for a very long time, for many decades, has had a policy which is, prevalent now in a number of communities, but was sort of groundbreaking at the time it was adapted, which is sort of a smart growth concept, which is basically to try to concentrate all of the urban development in a relatively small area where you have access to public infrastructure like roads, water lines, sewer lines, schools, all of the types of things people need to live in a community, to concentrate that in a focused area and then preserve open space and ag lands in the areas that are sort of more far flung from that infrastructure. That has a real benefit for climate purposes, so that you can reduce the need to use cars to travel long distances, what we now refer to as VMT. But in any event, that policy has been in place for a long time. And as we're working on the current general plan update, because as you can see here, the last time it was updated was 1994, which is quite a while ago now. We're trying to implement even more modern best practices and ways to both allow for a significant number of new housing, but also do it in such a way that is environmentally conscious and very conserving of resources, whether it's energy, water, transportation, all of those sorts of things, and continuing to focus growth in these same sort of urbanized areas. What does that mean for the San Lorenzo Valley? Well, what it means is basically, as we go into this next housing update cycle, the San Lorenzo Valley is still going to remain what it is for the most part currently today, which is predominantly a rural area. Now, we do have these concentrations of these existing historic communities, as you all are familiar with, along Highway 9, so Boulder Creek, Ben Lomond, Felton, and so forth. And those will continue to be there. And they do have some newer development opportunities that are opening up. But it is not where the bulk of the new housing is going to go, because obviously there's not a ton of infrastructure here for new development. So there's many areas that don't have access to public sewer and water systems and so forth. So let's look a little bit closer into the details about the housing allocation. So I'm showing you the numbers here. These are the same numbers that Alyssa shared with you. I've got the county's numbers highlighted on the top. Now, as she mentioned, it is about triple what our last allocation was. However, it's not triple of the highest we've ever gotten. We did actually in some earlier cycles get some numbers that were more in closer to this range, maybe not quite as high as they are now, but closer to this range. The last cycle was a particularly low allocation because it was done sort of in the midst of the last recession. And so there was a lot of housing stock that was vacant because it had been foreclosed on. And, you know, there was all of that economic turmoil that was happening. So most communities in the state got a lower allocation than they would have otherwise in the last cycle because of that. I've also highlighted here Scotts Valley's numbers because I know we're going to be looking at Scotts Valley as well. Now, I like to look at things visually. So I plotted all our numbers on a graph so you could see it in a more visual way. So you can see the county's numbers are here. The green represents the allocation because, as Alyssa mentioned, these numbers are allocated in different income categories. And so you can see the green at the bottom is the very low income. The blue is what they call low income. The moderate is in red and the above moderate is in yellow. You might ask yourself, what do these labels mean? They're basically means that housing that is produced that is expected to be affordable once it hits the market to a certain income group. We get the numbers that establish these different income levels from HUD, the Federal Housing and Urban Development Agency. And so basically the first three categories, for the most part these days, it wasn't always this way, but in the current housing costs that we have, generally all of these three categories, for the most part, are either subsidized or deed restricted housing types, whereas the one in the yellow is what we would generally think of as market rate housing. It just goes for whatever, you know, the developer wants to sell it for. Most of the time, most of the single family housing that is produced these days is going to wind up in this yellow category. The moderate would generally be things like maybe some condominiums and townhomes that are not deed restricted, but more than likely it might just be below market rate housing that's produced in market rate developments. And then the low and the very low, generally these are units. They might be accessory dwelling units in some cases, or the bulk of them generally are subsidized housing that is developed in larger rental projects like apartment communities that are developed by some of our nonprofit housing developers. Okay, let's look at it another way. In this chart, I took the same numbers and I just charted it by the different income categories. And then you can see the different cities and county represented in the color. So you kind of get a sense of comparatively, you can see the bulk of the units in the cycle are in this above MUD or market rate category. And then in the next highest category is in the very low. You might ask yourself, why is that? Well, for the most part, the way these numbers come out is they look at population data that we get from the census and where people's incomes actually fall in this range of these different income categories between, very low to, very high, essentially. And as many people talk about nowadays, if you listen to discussions about economics or federal policy and anything like that, you may hear people often talking about income disparities, that the vast majority of people in the country these days seeming to be the numbers are the highest at the ends of the spectrum. So there's fewer people essentially in the middle. And sometimes people talk about this as something like the erosion of the middle class or what have you. There's fewer people in the middle and more people at the end. So there's a lot of people that are in this very low category and a lot of people that are in the higher category and just not that many people in the middle. And what that reflects is really the wage scale in our economic structure, that you have a lot of folks in these service sector jobs that maybe don't pay that well. They may not pay a living wage. And then you may have a lot of people in these jobs that pay really a lot, like the tech sector, the finance sector, things like that. And fewer folks in the middle. Generally speaking, these middle categories would be people often that are in public service, teaching, other types of local government work, healthcare, things like that. So that's kind of why you see that the highest allocations are sort of at the ends of the economic spectrum rather than in the middle. Now, let's look at San Lorenzo Valley a little bit. What I've lit on the map here, and this is from the county's geographic information system, which we refer to as the GIS, which is this really great technology that we have. And the great thing for all of you guys to know is that we have a public facing website where you can look at these maps and you can pull up a lot of these same data layers yourself and really drill down. You can zoom in and focus on a particular address. You can get all sorts of information. It's very interesting, very useful for folks who are either wanting to learn about how to do different developments or people who might be doing research. We have information on biotic resources, water resources, all sorts of good stuff here. In this particular map, what I'm showing is the San Lorenzo Valley, and then we have this data layer, which is called census urban areas. What does that mean? That means that the census does analysis on population density. So how many people are living within a square mile? They get that information from the census, population surveys that are done every 10 years. So what we call the decennial census. And then they map those addresses and they come up with areas where these geographies meet a certain population density per square mile. So in other words, what does this mean? This means these are the areas that have de facto urban densities, even if we don't really think of them traditionally as urban areas. And the reason for that is there may be historic development that has been happening in these areas, as we know, for a long time, since the earliest days of our county, the logging era and so forth, mining era. And then also there's a certain number of residential development that happens often without permits. You may have people just pulling a trailer onto a lot and not asking anybody's permission. And if they answered the census and told the census taker that they live there, that contributes to the population density. I am mentioning on this slide here that we recognize in our planning that there are a lot of challenges in developing new housing or even maintaining the existing housing in this area. You know, obviously we've got really steep slopes, we've got, you know, forest cover, we've got, it's very rural. We have generally a lack of sewer and water availability, except for in the little town centers in some cases. And then as we all know, the horrible disaster of the CZU fire, and we are still working very hard to help folks recover from that. So these are some of the challenges that we know exist for the central San Lorenzo Valley. What can we do? So on this slide, I'm sharing some things that are efforts the county is undertaking to try to help make housing development easier. And in the bold here are the things that are of particular interest for the San Lorenzo Valley. So let's talk a little bit about this first item. As I mentioned earlier, the sustainability update and code modernization. What is that? Well, remember I mentioned the general plan. What that means is basically it's an update to our 1994 general plan. So we're updating the land use element and several of the other elements, circulation, transportation, open space and conservation. And then we're also doing some corresponding modernization updates to our existing zoning codes to kind of bring them into the 21st century and make things a little more understandable and current with current state laws and so forth. That is a super important thing that is going on that I think is going to benefit all areas of the county. And I'll show you a little bit more on that in just a moment. ADU policies and programs. As you may know, there's been a lot of change in the state laws regarding ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units. They are accessory generally to a single family home. So as a local government, we are required to implement those state laws. You know, they preempt any local codes that we may have. And so we've been working in recent years to update our local codes to match whatever the state folks are adopting. Every year they seem to write several new bills about ADUs, so then we have to update our zoning codes all over again every time they do that, which is an additional workload effort that is a little challenging, but we have been doing it nonetheless. We're also working at our board's request on new policies for tiny homes, because that seems to become a really hot topic for folks these days. So we're trying to develop some policies to enable those to be used. SB 9 is an interesting bill. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It relates to those urbanized areas that I showed you on the map previously. It really does have some potential to be very helpful potentially in the San Lorenzo Valley. And then of course the fire recovery efforts. So regarding the sustainability update, I'm sharing here a screenshot of our county website, and you can see the URL here at the top. We have just a ton of very interesting, hopefully, information on the website here and ways that the community can get involved. We just concluded a series of 6 or 7 community meetings, some were in person, some were on Zoom. And if you missed those, there are recordings of those meetings available on this site. You can navigate through the menu here and find where those recordings are, where you can get an overview on each section of these updates. So each section of the general plan that is being updated, there was a separate community meeting focused on each of those topics. There's a survey. You can take the survey and share your input on various questions related to this update effort. And then you can also just email our staff that's working on this and give them your thoughts, ask them your questions. You can subscribe to get emails about the process as it goes through the next few steps. So the next few steps on this actually are, now that they've released the draft documents, they've also recently released the draft EIR. Those documents are going to be made available for a certain comment period, and then eventually they'll be taking that material to the County Planning Commission and then the board for adoption toward the end of this calendar year. So I encourage you all to, take a look at this material, dive in, geek out, on all this planning information. It covers topics like urban design, design guidelines. So if you're interested in architecture and that kind of thing, there's stuff for you. If you're interested in ag land or timberland preservation, there's content related to that. There's a lot of content on housing. So it's just a really, really big, very important effort. And it actually is what will set the foundation for housing development. It will be what the housing element analysis is based on when we do start the housing element update process in early 2023. So moving on, this is another map of the San Lorenzo Valley, and this is a map that is included in the draft sustainability update documents. Now there's a legend over here on the side. Again, because it's not really zoomed in, you can't see it that well at this level, but basically you can see these little areas here are the existing, communities of Ben Lomond, San Lorenzo Valley, sort of the areas that do have some sewer and water availability. For the most part, there's not really any changes to the designations of all these areas. So there's not really any changes on the map right now proposed for San Lorenzo Valley, but it's just using the terminology that might be slightly different than the terminology used for these different categories in the old general plan maps. So again, for the most part, the few changes that are being made to the maps are happening really in the coastal urbanized areas, Live Oak, Aptos, and SoCal and so forth. But just to show you what the materials look like in this sustainability update package, this is the specific map for San Lorenzo Valley. We also have a website for folks interested in ADUs. We've been updating this as all the laws get updated and the zoning codes get updated for ADUs. And so you can click through here if you're interested in developing an ADU. There's a lot of resources. We've spent a lot of time and effort pulling all these resources together to hopefully help folks. The good news is that most ADUs now only require a building permit. They do not require a discretionary planning permit like they used to. For folks that are on septic, it still might require a little bit of an analysis of your septic to make sure it's adequate, but it's a much easier process than it used to be. And also, a number of the fees are no longer applicable, particularly if you're developing an ADU that is 750 square feet or less. A lot of the impact fees that used to apply are no longer applicable to those units. So if you have any questions about that, I encourage you to look at this page. Our staff contact numbers are here. You can call our building counter for questions. You can make an appointment with building staff. We have an online self-scheduler where you can make an appointment to talk to the building staff either on the phone or by Teams or in person, whatever you can prefer, whatever you prefer. Moving on, tiny homes. So there's a lot of talk about this. People throw around the term a lot casually. The way it's defined in terms of California law is that any housing unit that is a full-fledged housing unit, a dwelling unit that is 400 square feet or less is technically a tiny home. So many existing studio apartments, ADUs that are in this size range, even in some cases, maybe a primary home in a really rural area or something might be in this size range. That is technically a tiny home. Now, we call those a tiny home on a foundation to distinguish from what you see here in the picture, which is a tiny home on wheels. So tiny homes on a foundation are already allowed. You know, if you're building a house on a lot somewhere and you want to make it 400 square feet or less, you have every right to do that. Nobody's going to tell you it has to be bigger than that. Or if you're building an ADU and you want it to be in that size range, that's very common. That happens all the time. The area that needs some new policies that's not really currently addressed in our codes is for the tiny homes on wheels. And because these have become more popular, there's like, Netflix series about these, and there's all kinds of material on YouTube about these. People have been asking for ways to legalize these, and the board has directed staff to develop policies for this. We have started that process and have conducted some community outreach meetings and surveys and held some meetings and so forth. And there's a whole bunch of material on this website here at the bottom. We have a whole bunch of background material. We have recordings of some of those community meetings, links to reports we provided to our board, all kinds of good stuff here at this link that you can come up to speed on where we are on this policy project. We are planning to bring a draft set of policies to our housing and planning commissions, either in late summer or early fall this year, and then hopefully go to the board shortly after that for adoption of those policies. Now, the first component of the policies that will be brought forward is for use of tiny homes on wheels, generally speaking, in a project where it would be like the tiny home is either the primary dwelling unit on that property or maybe an ADU. There's a second component of this, which is some people have expressed interest in doing something called a tiny home village, which might be where you have, maybe a large rural lot of several acres or more, and you want to have, 10 or 20 or so of these, almost like a little low density multifamily development kind of situation. And so that's a slightly more complicated undertaking for various reasons. So we're separating that into a second phase. So that will be a second phase we're going to dive into after we do the initial policy package just for using tiny homes on wheels, really as an ADU or a primary residence. Okay, let's talk about SB 9 a little bit. This is another hot topic. This is a law that was just passed last year and took effect in January. This is very interesting and of key interest, I think, for San Lorenzo Valley, because I think there's a lot of lots in the valley where this may be an option that people are really interested in. So what it allows you to do, and you can see some diagrams, I've cut these out of our website. So these are on our webpage if you go to the link here. These are some of the basic options that you could do if you had a property and you wanted to pursue SB 9. Now, there's a couple key requirements to be allowed to do an SB 9 project. First of all, it has to be an existing property in a single family residential zone. How do you know if it's in a residential zone? Well, you need to look at our zoning map, or you can call our staff, or you can go online to our GIS system, our web portal, type in your address, and you can, click on the zoning layer and see what kind of zone your property has. It also has to be in an urbanized area. Well, remember that map I showed you? Let's see here. This is the urbanized area. So if your property is in one of these areas and is zoned for residential single family, then you've crossed half of the bridge to getting you into an SB 9 project. Some of the other criteria is it has to be an owner-occupied property, and it has to be outside of certain sensitive environmental areas like, habitat protection area, maybe a landslide risk or earthquake fault zone, those sorts of things. So if you go to our website here, it has a list of what these sensitive environmental issues are that it has to avoid. So let's say your property meets all that stuff. Then you have several different options. The first choice is, do you want to add units without splitting your lot in two, or do you want to split your lot in two? So if you're doing it without splitting your lot in two, where you see the PD here, that means primary dwelling. That's the main home on the site. You can add an ADU. You can build another primary dwelling, and that primary dwelling can have a junior ADU. You can build an attached second primary dwelling. This would be like what we would call typically a duplex. So you have two primary dwellings next to each other. Sometimes it's called a duet. And then each primary dwelling could have a detached ADU or maybe even an attached ADU, or you could have the ADUs attached to each other. That's one option. The other option is you could actually split the lot, and then each lot could have 2 units on it. And those 2 units could include either 2 primary dwelling units or a primary dwelling unit and an ADU. So these are just some of the different options that would be possibilities using SB 9. Now you might ask, why would somebody want to do this? Well, we hear a lot of times from folks who want to provide housing for their children. You know, housing has gotten so expensive that many people's kids who have grown up in this area cannot afford, you know, $1.5 million to buy a house in the area. So if they are on a large lot in one of these eligible areas, let's say maybe it's a 10-acre lot or a 15 or 20-acre lot, you can split it in half and, you know, build a house for your kids on that lot. That one of the other rules here is that the lots have to be roughly equal in size. So in other words, the smaller one cannot be less than 40% of the, you know, total lot. So in other words, you can't have like a 10-acre lot and just carve off 5,000 square feet and make it the second lot. They have to be roughly equal. That's in the state bill, for whatever reason. So again, we have a lot of information for anyone who might be interested in this. The other issue is that the urbanized areas that I showed you on the map, not all of those areas are on public sewer and water. So even though you can entertain these types of developments, it could be pricey. You might need to do some upgrades for your septic to accommodate these new units. And so you'd want to start talking to environmental health at the county early on to try to understand what, if any, of those upgrade requirements might be and what they might cost you. So that's going to be a key driver of cost to pursue one of these developments. This is just a little bit closer zooming in of SLV. And although it does show Scotts Valley, obviously we don't do planning for Scotts Valley. They do their own permitting. So if you are in this city, you'd have to talk to Scotts Valley staff about those options. I mentioned the fire. We know this continues to be a big challenge. Folks are trying to rebuild. We do have a special permit center in the basement. It's working every day. And it's just for people affected by the fire who are trying to rebuild. This is their contact info. There's also a community tool shed for folks. It's every Saturday in Boulder Creek at the rec facility there. So folks, if you're interested in this, this is the link right here. We're also working on a new thing called the Unified Permit Center, which is like a one-stop shop for development review. So this means that not only would you have planning and building staff at the front counter, you would also have folks from Public Works, from environmental health, from county fire, all the folks that we can get to come and staff the center, so that if you're coming in, let's say you're driving in from Boulder Creek, you would be able to potentially see staff from all these different agencies at the same time, show them your building plans and get them to comment on your plans, you know, through literally a one-stop at the center. So this is something that we're working on currently. It's not fully launched yet. The board did authorize funds for us to get some additional staff to operate this center and also to remodel the front counter so that it will be much more customer friendly and comfortable for everybody and more conducive to this new UPC concept. So we expect that that will be building out over the next year, and we're hopeful that that will make it a lot easier for folks to come in, find out what they're allowed to do on their properties, and then get the permits that they need. This is just a little more detail on this and how the operation is envisioned once we have it up and running. Another special project that we have going on right now is something called the Veterans Village, which a local vets group down in Santa Cruz took the initiative and got a bunch of support from the Community Foundation and some other stakeholders, and were able to buy the Jay's Timberline Resort. They received a large state grant, and they're going to be renovating this property and adding a few new modular units, and they'll be operating it as an affordable housing project for veterans, some veterans that were formerly homeless. And so we're working with that group now to help them, access those state funds and carry out their project. So hopefully it will be done in approximately a year, more or less. And they are doing a sort of a grant award ceremony around the Memorial Day weekend coming up very soon. Future opportunities. This is where folks can get involved, as I mentioned. I highly encourage any of you that are interested to, actually, I see I have a typo on my slide here. It should say sustainability update, not sustainability element. To get involved with the sustainability update project, that's going to be super important for our county unincorporated area going forward. You can get involved and participate in the tiny homes policy development, obviously starting in early 2023 with the housing element update. And then there's a special couple of meetings coming up real soon next week for the CZU fire. Anybody involved with that, they've put out a plan for how they're going to use federal funds to assist folks in the fire affected areas. The initial plan is rolling out $46 million for owner occupied rehab loans, $9 million for homebuyer loans. And then, so these amounts, these first two bullets here are at the statewide level. So they're available to folks that were affected by the 2020 disasters, including in Santa Cruz County, but it's not exclusive to Santa Cruz County. This third bullet is specifically allocated for Santa Cruz County. So $43 million will be available just in our county for new affordable rental housing projects. Now that money is available to projects located in the 4 cities as well as in the unincorporated county. There's a couple of Zoom meetings coming up next week. One will be in English and the second one will be in Spanish. So if you're interested in that, I can put the Zoom link for those in the chat. And that concludes my presentation. And I think we're going to hold questions until after the final speaker.
Yes. Thank you, Suzanne. And now we're going to jump over to Jack Dillis to hone in on Scotts Valley.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Jack Dillis, a city council member, and Jim Reed, our vice mayor, may be adding his comments as we go along. If I could see a screen share, Suzanne, I'd like to speak a little bit more about Scotts Valley's regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA numbers, and talk about how that's changing for us. There it is. Thank you. So this shows you some information, but just as an intro to this, I'd like to just say that Scotts Valley currently has a population of 12,049, just over 12,000, and we have about 4,800 homes. And so what this shows you on the left, of course, are the different classes of, I call them classes, different categories of affordability. And then the middle column are the current RHNA numbers, and the column on the right side represents the new numbers between 2023 and 2031. They're not quite final yet, but it certainly looks like they're headed there. As we heard earlier, they've been approved by Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments as a draft methodology, and they will be finalized later in the fall. So turning first to the current numbers, you can see at the bottom, there have been 100 for the last, 2015 to 2023, we've had a goal of 140, the plan at 140 homes to be built with these different categories. Something close to 60% would be in the affordability categories. And we've actually exceeded, the good news is we've exceeded the 140. We've, the developers have built 184 homes over that period. However, we have not met the various affordable categories. So instead of building 34 very low, we've actually had 0. And instead of building 22 low units, we've only had 10 built. And instead of having 26 moderate, we've had so we've had 8. And now moving ahead to the right-hand column, the new numbers for the period July 2023 to 2031, we have a goal now of 1,220 units to be built over those 8 years, 2023, 2031. That's almost 9 times our last goals. So that's a significant increase, and about 2/3 of those would need to be affordable in those first 3 categories. As you can see, that's going to be a challenge for us. And of course, we love challenges, and we'll do our best. But this will be some work. And so what that 1,220 new homes represents are about 3,000 people, or about 25% increase in our population over those 8 years. And we currently have about 2.5 people on average in each home. That's how the math works. And so, we've got to look at our opportunities. How can we make this happen? And one of the questions that I want to have answered, and we'll have to answer it when we do our housing element that's due at the end of 2023, we need to make sure we've zoned for enough units. And so right now, I don't know how much rezoning we would have to propose to make that happen, but that has to be part of our analysis. So we'll have some good study sessions on that, I'm sure. So of course, we do care about the public input. We need to meet these goals, and yet we need to do it in a way that the community, what the community wants. So we'll certainly be having our required hearings, getting lots of public input. And of course, we want to get as much input as we can. So I encourage everyone to weigh in on this and talk about how we might meet some of these requirements, not just because that's required, but also obviously we need more affordable housing. So service workers and our kids and everyone else could have a place to live. And I know it's a big challenge, not just in Scotts Valley, but everywhere. So we'll be dealing with this. And Jim, did you have any comments you'd like to add on this?
Thanks very much, Jack. Great summary. And then real quick for Tim and Linda, how much time would you like me to take? Maybe 10 minutes or?
Yeah, 10's fine.
Sounds great. Okay, well, to Tim and Linda, thank you especially for partnering with Alyssa and the wonderful folks at Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. These dialogues are so necessary, not only for sharing best practices with elected officials, but in a system of government like ours, things are possible or not possible to the extent to which the public can be brought behind them as well. So it's not just connecting with folks like us who are either elected officials or the small minority of folks who like to geek out on housing policy, but we all have a very large challenge to communicate this to our broader communities and make them understand why it's in their interest that our kids and our teachers and our cops and our firefighters have an opportunity to actually live in this beautiful area that we're fortunate enough to call home. And events like this, I think, are a huge part of it. As Jack and Suzanne noted, I think Jack called it a challenge. So Jack certainly appreciates understatement. We absolutely do have some huge numbers that we need to hit. Folks can make the case that it's long overdue for areas like ours to have received numbers like this, and that's a fair argument. At the same time, there's no getting around the fact that having to zone for our town growing by 25% in the next year and a half is going to be a tall order. It's going to be a tall order for staff. As Jack noted, public input is going to be critical, and we're going to have an awful lot of people who aren't going to understand why they have to do all the things that these RHNA numbers are forcing us to do, why we don't have maybe some of the authority that we've traditionally had, or folks have traditionally thought that we had, whether we had it or not. So as we look to build, to figure out a place to put a 4-figure amount of units, different folks can agree or disagree, but I think one thing that we've clearly got to take a look at is our town center. One thing, as Jack noted, Scotts Valley hasn't done an awful job, I think better than most of the jurisdictions in Santa Cruz in terms of always having a mentality that well-planned, thoughtful development can coexist with our small town character that we all love and want to preserve. And it can be done in a way without taxing our environment. And we've made progress on that. We absolutely have fallen short and have a long way to go on doing better on the number of very low and low units. And you'll see from these numbers, we're not going to have a choice, especially as we figure out and are able to communicate to the public the types of penalties that the city could pay if we don't fulfill these numbers. So one thing I think we've clearly got to have at the top of our list is, for those of you who aren't familiar with Scotts Valley that much, or our town center, that's where the old airport property used to be, right in the heart of town, right by where Sky Park is now. There's several parcels there that the city acquired under RDAs. There are several parcels that the city of Santa Cruz continues to own. And that entire area behind our library, behind the Kmart shopping center, which is going to be the Target shopping center, by the park, over down to the corner of Mount Herman and Sky Park, there's about 30 acres there. And when I moved into town back in the year 2000, the folks I bought my home from in Sky Park, where I still live, they gave us, information on the house warranty, the washer warranty, and all that stuff. And they also included an article about the town center that Scotts Valley had been trying to build back in the 90s. And I'm hoping Michael Schulman is still with us. Michael was on the council for a term in the 90s, and this was a priority for the city then. And 25, 30 years later, we're still hoping that we can make it happen. The good news is the city's taken some concrete steps towards making it a reality. And especially with these numbers, I think the chances of us being able to move forward with a development like this are higher than ever. And the plan that we have currently was approved. The city, actually, take a step back, the city is the one that put together our own plan. We used RDA money so that we could come up with a plan, and we've been shopping that to developers basically for the last 15 years because we wanted the city to be in control of that process, not at the mercy of developers. And when we developed that plan back in 2006, the commercial retail market in particular had not seen the huge migration to online that we've seen since then. And that plan called for approximately I think at least, maybe it was 200,000 square feet of commercial, which is quite a bit, and up to 250 housing units. And since then, of course, the change that we've had is buying patterns have gone online so much that it's not realistic that we're going to be able to get that kind of commercial activity that would produce that kind of revenue or need that kind of footprint. And so we're going to be focused more on sort of a lifestyle town center that would have, a wine bar and ice cream shops and a village green and restaurants with cafes that would front that village green. And you could hopefully create sort of an Abbott Square type development. And then also have a significant housing component to go with it. And the number of units that we still have left to hit in that housing goal is approximately 250. But with these RHNA numbers that we have, we're going to be looking everywhere we can for alternatives on how we can accommodate this kind of growth within the city. And I think one of the things we've clearly got to take a look at is how we can get more density there. And one of the reasons I think that makes so much sense is that the town center project is only about 500 feet from our transit center. And folks who aren't familiar with Scotts Valley might not realize you can get on the Highway 17 bus that goes over the hill in the morning, and it takes you about 50 minutes, and it will drop you down at Diridon Station in downtown San Jose, which is going to be the center of the new Google development that's taking place there. That's going to be 7 million square feet. That's larger than the Pentagon, which for many decades was the world's largest office space. That project also is going to have 4,000 housing units, 1,000 of which are going to be rent restricted affordable. But long story short, when we're talking about giving people an easy way to use public transit to get to job centers like that, you better believe that's the place where we should look at having some density. And I think another reason we need to give that very serious thought is we've heard from a consultant, Robert Gibbs from Harvard University, one of the leading proponents of town center, village center developments anywhere in the country, say that for us to have that Abbott Square lifestyle center that I think we all want to some extent, we're probably going to need a few more units than we currently have budgeted for. So I think giving good consideration to the town center and having something like that there is a big step that we all need to take. And that has relevance not just to folks in Scotts Valley, I think, but also San Lorenzo Valley. You know, in a lot of very real ways, San Lorenzo Valley's Main Street is Highway 1. And also in a lot of ways, another main street or something awfully close to a main street is Mount Herman Road. Mount Herman Road in Scotts Valley is the second busiest road in the entire county. And it's not because of the 12,000 people that live here. It's because of us plus San Lorenzo Valley, plus folks in Pasatiempo. So having a lifestyle center with more shopping options and more housing options, I think will be great for the entire Scotts Valley, San Lorenzo Valley region. So that's a priority I think we need to focus on. I think anybody who's concerned about making sure that these RHNA numbers turn into reality, or making sure that Scotts Valley can zone for these RHNA numbers in such a way that we're not going to get punished by the state and lose transportation funding, lose funding for law enforcement, or have other penalties come down on us from the state if we don't hit these numbers. That's clearly someplace that we need to look. Another place that I think is long overdue for action is extending the city's inclusionary boundary to cover the entire city. When Scotts Valley established its RDA, I think back in the early 90s, the RDA boundary was checkerboarded. It included probably about 2/3 of the city, but not all of it, and it excluded a lot of parcels where there's interest in development going on today. And I know Jack and I in particular have for years been encouraging us to extend that 15% citywide. You know, to a large extent, if we're letting somebody build housing in coastal California, to a fair extent, we're actually giving them a license to basically print money. They're going to make a good amount of profit off of something like that. And it's not unreasonable at all for the city to say that in return for this profit we're going to enable you to make, we're also going to ask you to contribute towards the costs that are going to come with a development like this and the services that we're going to need to support that kind of development, and also the people that it will take to support those services. And that means having housing for them to live in. It'll also be important just because, you know, we can all have discussions about whether our planning departments are moving quickly enough. The one thing, people can agree or disagree about whether we're moving fast enough. The one thing we can all agree on, though, is I think more certainty for our development community partners and treating them as partners is the way that we're going to get to some of these numbers is absolutely an essential thing. And we're in a situation now where, you know, folks come to me or they come to Jack or some of the other council members and they might talk about a small housing project they want to do, and they don't have affordable units in there. And you ask them why, and they say, well, we don't have to. And then, you know, at least I tell those folks, well, from my perspective, I'm not going to support any project that doesn't have 15% inclusionary. And they understandably look surprised, a little angry, a little frustrated, because that's not what our regs say. And so I think that's why it's really important. We are very, very long overdue to get this done. I think there's a majority on the council who wants to do it. Jack and I have certainly been pushing for it for a while. We have a fantastic staff, starting with our city manager down to folks on the front lines in our city. But we can do a better job about making this a priority. We can also do a better job about making it a priority to finish our housing, our general plan update. 4 years ago, when I was running for re-election, I would talk about updating the general plan. I would talk about extending that ADU boundary. And 4 years later, we're still talking about the same things. So we've got to do a little bit better, in my opinion, as a city in addressing what I think we all know is the challenge of our time, the challenge of our generation in coastal California. And that is, how do we close one of the most severe wealth disparities anywhere on the planet? How do we close one of the most high-priced housing markets, not just anywhere in the country, but anywhere on the planet, in the southern San Francisco Bay region? We've got to get better about how we can plan for a future where folks in the middle actually have a chance to live here. And if we can't do that through an inclusionary ordinance, updating our general plan, figuring out how we can plan for more housing construction, in a way that will minimize the burden on city services and traffic, I don't know how we can do it. One other thing I'm hoping we can put in the chat, Jack and I have also spent a fair amount of time talking about this among each other, is really pushing some of the ADU concepts that Suzanne was talking about earlier. Some of you may know in my day job, I work for the city of San Jose and in the mayor's office. And what we've done there in the last couple of years, we established a website called sjbackyardhomes.com. That's sjbackyardhomes.com. And some of the things that Suzanne's talking about around permitting and just providing resources for people around this concept, we've already had some success with over the last several years working out of the mayor's office. So that website that I just mentioned is intended to be a one-stop shop for people looking to get information about how affordable it is, about permitting, what's involved, what the costs could be, both the city costs and the costs of the unit themselves. And some of you may recall about, I guess, maybe 10, 12 years ago, virtually all the cities in Santa Cruz County and the county itself together followed a lead. I think it was mainly pushed by Supervisor Coonerty, who might have been on the council then in Santa Cruz, to really prioritize green building standards and to adopt measures that would require new construction to use green building practices in a way that was unlike anything that had been done anywhere else in the country. And virtually every jurisdiction in the county got behind those. And we were the first county in the country that said, if you're going to build in Santa Cruz County, you're going to have this baseline of green building that you're going to have to follow. I would absolutely love us to be the first county in California that has a whole new approach to ADUs. And it's some of the things that, again, that Suzanne had talked about the one-stop shop permitting center. In San Jose, what we've done is we have what we call ADU Tuesdays. And so on Tuesdays, you don't need an appointment. If you want to build an ADU, you just walk in, and in theory, there's going to be staff who's there ready to help you with your ADUs on the fly. And we marry that with pre-approved ADU designs. I think about when we launched this about 3 years ago, we had 6 or 7 designs. Now we've got over 20. And very soon we're looking at that number potentially going up to 30 and 40. So we're talking about all different sizes, all different designs, a variety of different construction types and costs. And if people use a pre-approved plan, then the need to have weeks and weeks of permitting and to have inspectors come out on site, it shrinks radically. And so we're really hopeful if we can put something together where pre-approved plans are the norm in Santa Cruz, where staff is dedicated towards being a one-stop shop, where we can advertise, right? So when folks who live in Santa Cruz County type in backyard home or ADU or granny unit, there's a little ad that'll pop up that says, here's where you can go to get more information on how easy it is. We're also looking at trying to find loan products that could work, for a wealthy homeowner that's got good credit, a lot of equity in their home. It's not a problem for them to get a loan to build an ADU unit. For folks maybe whose credit isn't as high, where they don't have as much equity, it can be a little harder. And so how can we work with the private sector, get some private sector partners to maybe help us set up a revolving fund to make it easier to access. So I think there's a real opportunity on ADUs in particular that we're all looking to take advantage of. And then the last thing that I would say, just real quick, I included something about our homeless neighbors. And obviously one of the huge reasons that we have the homelessness problem we do in coastal California is because the cost of housing is so high. And there have been very few good things that have come out of this global pandemic. One of the few that has been a positive development in California is that we have seen a relaxation and a quickening of standards for getting new construction built when it comes to emergency interim housing. And we've had some success in San Jose, and other jurisdictions are having success putting up units up to 100 an acre where we have wraparound services on site. You do it on public land often, for example, the other side of the land that's on the back of one of those freeway walls. You get services on site. Every unit has a door that locks and a bathroom and a window and a desk. And you're able to put 100 units to an acre. And if you prioritize folks who are already homeless in the area, a lot of the concerns that a lot of neighbors have over having homeless folks anywhere close to them could dissipate, because we're able to truthfully talk about how the homeless that are living in our streets and our creeks and our parks are actually going to be move into someplace that's safe and to help get them on their feet. So there's a lot of good things that are happening elsewhere, and that's where the role of Monterey Bay Economic Partnership is so essential, just in sharing those best practices. So thanks for letting us take a few minutes to talk about some of the ideas we're really excited about in Scotts Valley.
Thank you, Jim. And now we're going to close off with a few minutes from Linda Kerner to tell you what you can do, and then we'll go to questions. Linda.
Okay, so I will be really brief because I want to allow time for the members attending to be able to ask their questions. And many of the speakers have already mentioned how important it is to have community input when our local governments move forward with the next housing element cycle. But I want to also impress upon the community members that before we move forward with the new housing element cycle, there's something very important that you can do right now. And what that is when there are affordable housing projects on the Board of Supervisors or City Council agendas, you need to show up. You need to support those projects. The NIMBYs are always going to be there. Their voices can be very loud and vocal. But remember those RHNA numbers that our governments are now being challenged to meet. And one thing that wasn't mentioned, I don't think by any of the other speakers, is new this year with the next housing element cycle, the state has now a new accountability unit, and they are really, really going to be holding jurisdictions' feet to the fire. They want them to meet those RHNA goals. So you need to show up at these board meetings and council members and support affordable housing projects. You will make it easier for your local electeds to move projects forward if they know community members have their backs. So turning out, showing up really makes a difference. Your voice makes a difference. If people can live where they work and spend their paychecks at local businesses, play in our parks and participate in our community events, our communities will thrive. Our goal is for everyone in our community to have a place to call home. You can help to make that happen if you step up and get involved. That is the critical role you all have to play as community members. You have your assignment.
Thank you, Linda. Now we'll go to questions. So if you click on raise hand, we can get to questions. And Alyssa, are you going to?
Yes, I'm happy to help facilitate the chat, Q&As in the chat, as well as the Q&A section itself. But I do see that we have a question here early on from Darius Mosenin. He asks, or she, is there any possibility of novel sewage treatment systems, incinerators, composting being approved to allow for the hundreds of sub 1 acre lots to be built on? Does anyone want to take that one on?
Sure. The health and safety codes related to wastewater management really are set at the state level at this point. And locally, it's our environmental health agency that has responsibility for implementing and monitoring for those standards. So if you have any questions about, what standards apply to a small lot like that and what types of treatment systems you might be able to use, I would encourage you to reach out to our environmental health division. You can just Google Santa Cruz County Environmental Health. If you're in one of the cities, then more than likely you're probably on sewer, but if not, then you would talk to your local city planning department and see. But generally, environmental health has jurisdiction over that, even within the cities, if it is on septic.
It looks like Michael has a question.
I'm not seeing Michael's question. Is it in the chat, Tim?
No, he's got his hand up.
Let me unmute you, Michael, 1 second here as I play with the attendees. All right, you should be able to talk now, Michael.
Okay, can you hear me now?
You can.
Good, it's a lot easier than typing the question in.
True.
The number of units that the RENA goals are citing do not seem to, at least you haven't indicated that they indicate they have to be of a certain size. So would I be correct in believing that the number of units can include studios and one bedrooms that could be constructed? Is that true?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So
Yeah, could I jump in real quick though? There's an important point. The answer is yes, as Tim says, but Suzanne can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but unless there's specific paperwork on an ADU that says that it's going to be rent restricted deed somehow, those units are counted as above median income market. So even though, Michael, it's obviously a unit that's affordable by design, it's intended for an affordable budget, cities don't get credit for those being affordable units today, which is my understanding. So again, anyone feel free to jump in if they think I've misstated something.
I can add to that, just with respect to ADUs. You can actually get credit for them being in a lower income level if you have data to show that they are in the lower income level. So we will very often count ADUs in the low or very low categories. We do a rent survey to see what ADUs in our jurisdiction tend to be renting for. So we'll go on, Zillow, Craigslist, whatever market data you can gather. You can survey people who have ADUs, and HCD will usually accept that.
well, let me ask some follow-ups here. I'm actually a lot less focused on ADUs because I think that's, one here, one there. That's going to be very, very slow and hard to really get any volume in. I would really like to see the city have more focus on encouraging through zoning and whatever other incentives we can, construction of apartment buildings along Scotts Valley Drive. We have a lot of really older, less efficient commercial sites that I think are prime opportunities to do some apartments. So in this same along the same lines, if apartments are built and there are studio and one bedroom and potentially even two bedroom that are going to be more affordable by design, but they're not deed restricted to certain levels, can those and how will those be counted towards the affordable units that need to be built?
Yeah.
So it's the same method. So with the housing element reporting these numbers, we have to gather market data. So if they're non-deed restricted units, we would just have to gather market data on how much they're going to be rented for. So often if you have a new rental apartment project coming online, you'll look at their own marketing website to see what the rent levels are going to be. Or, you can communicate with the developer, see what the actual contract rents are. And if those rents wind up to be in the range that's affordable to, whichever income level, maybe it's low, maybe it's mod, whatever, then you can count those in that level, and you just have to retain that backup documentation in your files for HCD to audit if they ever ask for it. Generally, we would also look at sort of prevailing market rents for the same type of unit in the same area, because typically if somebody were to offer units up on the market and they're, let's say, way below what the prevailing rents are, pretty soon those units are probably going to be bid up to the higher, prevailing rent level one way or another. So
Right.
There are various ways of going about this. I've been doing this work for many, many years, and I've, collected that data and reported it to HCD, and they've yet to ever ask me for my actual backup documentation. So we'll see what happens going forward, but it's certainly possible to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. That sounds very reasonable to me. I'm glad to see that there is a kind of a common sense approach. Let me dig just a little bit deeper though. The affordable income levels, as I understand them, I don't think this has changed, vary based on 1, 2, 3, 4 members of the household, right? We often talk about the 4-member household, but if you're building say a 1-bedroom apartment, what income level is it considered to have just one person there and it's that income level, or is it considered 2 persons or 2 persons as a kid? What is the what is the determining factor
So the,
for deciding?
yeah, so the standard approach for that is, you know, for the purposes of analysis, we assume that the household size is one more than the number of bedrooms. So in other words, for a studio, you assume it's a 1 person. For a 1 bedroom, it's a 2-person household.
Okay,
So the state publishes the income limits, and they're, as they say, adjusted for household size. So there's a separate limit at each level for each different household size. Again, this is not rocket science. You can talk to your, you know, planning staff at whichever jurisdiction you're interested in if you want more detail on how we do this analysis. But I think we have some other questions, so maybe we can move on
Can
to
I-
another questioner.
Well,
If I
before
could
I,
just
before you
add
cut me
one-
off, can I just make one more comment? It's not a question, but for my elected representatives. We know that when you go for public input, it's not going to be popular to be asking for more housing. And I would encourage us to start talking about, instead of talking about population numbers at our traditional 2.5 person per household, we should be talking about these units as being smaller and having fewer people and being more resource efficient. And that way we're going to be able to dissuade some of those who are saying we're going to increase our population by 25%. We're not. We're going to increase our unit size, but the population, I think, will be at a lesser level than our traditional housing. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. So we will be ending our webinar at 2:30. That is in 1 minute. I know there are some great questions about water, about traffic, about shelters. We have plenty of more, you know, conversation to have in the community throughout the rest of this year and on. So I encourage you all to just check out the resources in the chat. Our websites, our emails are in there, and reach out. We would love to just talk with you one-on-one, maybe schedule another webinar or community meeting in the future. But unfortunately, that is the remaining time we have left. Does anyone want to leave any final words?
This is Jack. I'd just like to briefly say about, Michael brought up questions about apartments, and we have not been building apartments. They have not been built in our community, but there are a couple large projects under review that are proposing significant number of apartments. So we could see some of that change. And we do need more rental housing, not just for sale housing.
And we want to thank all of you for attending. And Linda put in the other Affordable Housing Month events, so tune into some more of them. There's lots of great information out there this month. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Enjoy the rest of your beautiful weekends. Let's continue this conversation.
Thank
Bye.
you.